Hey guys, how's it going? Avishai here with a new episode of What Israel Is. And today we will continue delving into what maybe Islam is and what secularism within the Muslim world is. And why has it, for the foreseeable future, and right now, why it has failed. So we discussed this briefly, or rather, we discussed the history of secularism within the Muslim world on the last episode. Today, I want to really delve into the reasons for why secularism has failed, and also discuss what replaced it. So, why has secularism failed within the Muslim world? I spoke a bit about the many forms that secularism would manifest within Muslim countries, and those are different. But one thing that usually they have in common is a strong central figure. And this is an important point because it is relevant not only to the secular reform within Muslim countries, but to all social reforms. And the point is this: a social reform simply cannot hinge on one person's force of personality. This is something that we have seen throughout history several times. We have seen it, for example, in Britain during the time of the British, or rather English Republic, when the monarchy was essentially abolished, and there was a central leader to the Republic by the name of Oliver Cromwell, and with his passing, his project simply did not survive. We have seen it more recently with Stalin. Now, of course, after Stalin's demise, the Soviet Union continued to exist, but it was on a road of decline from that moment onwards. The same could essentially be said of Mao Zedong, who essentially, after his death, despite the fact that China is still not a democracy and still styles itself the People's Republic of China, or it has undergone immense cultural changes and economical changes, and those are essentially products of the ideology behind Maoism dissolving gradually with the death of Mao. So those are several examples of how one single person cannot institute a social reform, at least not in such a way that it all hinges on his charisma. There has to be more. A lot more. Another reason that secularism has failed within those countries, those Muslim countries, is that the alternative to religiosity in those countries was essentially, in many cases, a murderous despot, or a more benign, perhaps fascist, which is still, even if he is not a genocidal maniac, he might be warmongering and thus may enter his countries into conflicts which cost millions of, or maybe thousands of lives and a lot of funds. And maybe one of the most important facets is that the idea of Pan-Arabism, also known as Nasserism, which is an idea of a unified Arab front fighting to restore the Arab world to its former glory of medieval times. Pan-Arabism is also manifest in the flags of many of the Arab countries. There are Pan-Arab colors, and the symbol usually for Pan-Arabism is Saladin's eagle, Salahuddin, which is the icon for the previous episode. This notion of Pan-Arabism ties in too well with Islam. Specifically, the idea of this unified Arab front ties in too well with the idea of Ummat al-Islamiyya, or the Ummah. Literally, the nation of Islam, which is a dogma within Islam of essentially there is a recognition of there being sovereigns to different Muslim countries, but above all, there is a notion of a nation, of a worldwide or a Muslim-wide nation that transcends local sovereigns. Think maybe of how in medieval times in Europe a cleric in Rome was capable of rousing armies all around Europe to go and conquer this little land where I'm broadcasting from. So that is a similar idea of Christendom and the Ummah. There are similar ideas. So what really replaced those things? Even earlier, before this secular project was in place, we already have maybe a reaction to the leniency of some of the more supposedly sophisticated Muslim countries, and this is most evident in one particular spiritual leader in what is today Saudi Arabia, and the name itself of the country is relevant to this story. This cleric was named Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and he essentially called for a reform within Islam. That sounds like a good idea today, but his reform was of a different sort than what you would imagine. What he called for is a return to the practices of Islam as they were in the 7th century. That is, it is called also Salafism. Within, we refer to the particular branch within Saudi Arabia as Wahhabism, but that is not a term that is used by Muslims. At least not commonly used, or if it is used as a derogatory term. What is Salafism? Salafism is using Muhammad and all of the people who are considered to be sainted to a degree as the best example of how a Muslim should behave. And when I say people who were sainted, I mean people who knew Muhammad himself. They are also not considered sainted within Salafism, which is maybe there is a very strict idea of how there is nothing more sacred than God, and distancing themselves away from anything that smells of idolatry or paganism. So saints are out of the picture. While again, there is also a notion of emulating Muhammad himself, and also the people who knew him. This ties in with a quote from Muhammad, who said that the best people in the world are those who live in my times. I'm paraphrasing. And after them, those that come after them are the second best, and so on and so on. Which comes to this conclusion that to be the best Muslim that you can, you need to go back to the sources. And that is essentially Salafism. So this Abdul Wahhab taught this branch of Islam with the intent of purifying the faith and purifying the believers. And a clan, a tribe leader by the name of Muhammad bin Saud came to this Abdul Wahhab with a proposed alliance to essentially teach all of his people Wahhabism, and the what he got in return was social and political stability. And this Muhammad bin Saud is the progenitor of the Saudi dynasty, the ruling family of Saudi Arabia, after which Saudi Arabia is named. In this country, which practices perhaps the most extreme and most literal form of Islam, is an ally to the United States, and it is sometimes said a covert ally, or maybe a partner in some ways, to Israel. This is inaccurate, to say the very least, but there are ways in which, under the surface, there are some connections there. despite the fact that it is one of the most leading forces in this spreading of this extreme ideology. Another form of radical or extreme Islam is that which is spread by the Muslim Brotherhood. The Muslim Brotherhood is best known in Egypt, but it is I won't say global, but a very widespread phenomena. You can find the Muslim Brotherhood in all sorts of Muslim countries. I should point out that both the Muslim Brotherhood and Salafism are interpretations of Sunni Islam. So I won't touch Shia Islam in this episode. Now, the Muslim Brotherhood, very similarly to Salafis or Salafist Muslims, claims this. They claim that our goal is Allah, the Quran is the letter of the law, Muhammad is our leader, jihad is the way, and death for the sake of Allah is our wish. Now, on the surface of it, this sounds very similar to the ideas of Wahhabi or Salafi Islam. There is the strive to instill Sharia law in all of the world, and obviously in all of the Muslim world. Sharia law is the law of the faith, but it is different. It is different in its stance in opposition to modernity. So whereas Salafism is an isolationist project, one that seeks to isolate itself from everything modern, the Muslim Brotherhood is a project of, I called it, jihad with genes. So the Muslim Brotherhood seeks to rather to go down to the level of those who might consider a modern lifestyle and entice them on that level. Dissimulation, subterfuge is a big issue within the Muslim Brotherhood. So, for example, the best known example of this is the whole idea of Islamophobia. This is a notion that was essentially invented, fabricated by the Muslim Brotherhood. What happened is that they noticed a trend within the Western world of sensitivity. This idea of respect towards people of all different cultures, and a sense of protection towards endangered minorities and etc. etc. So the way that they decided to hitch a ride on that is to turn the very idea of Islam into something that needs to be protected in that way. So replacing, for example, a people um, who need to be protected from hate and persecution, with an ideology that needs to be protected in that same way. And it has worked. We don't often stop to think about the fact that when one is calling another an Islamophobe, he is accusing him of being opposed to an ideology and not being bigoted against people. There is no equivalent term for being against Christianity or against Judaism or against any other religion. The only term that fits this is anti-theist. But this doesn't really, it's not the same, obviously, because an anti-theist is an atheist, and not all people who are bigoted against a certain faith, I'm almost certain most of them are theists. So there is nothing equivalent to the idea of Islamophobia. Now, bigotry against Muslims is another thing completely. But the whole idea of fabricating Islamophobia is to blur the line. Because essentially, the way they see it, there is no line. Muslims and Islam are the same thing. So that is one example of how they dissimulate. Now, what we see with the Islamic State is essentially maybe a mishmash of both forms of extreme Sunni Islam, where they actually have a dominion. The Islamic State behaves more like Salafi Jew. Talk about a Freudian slip. They behave more like Salafi Muslims. But when we look at their propaganda machine and their use of social media, in that way, they behave a lot more like the Muslim Brotherhood. They maybe don't use dissimulation as much as the Muslim Brotherhood does, but the whole idea of jihad with genes, the whole idea of talking on the level of this Muslim who is your average Joe, that's certainly there. Point that has risen to me while I was talking about this is that there is maybe an equivalent of this form of Orthodox Sunni Islam within Israeli Jewish culture, religion. We have, for example, the equivalent of the Wahhabi, the Salafi Islam, is the old form of Orthodoxy, the Haredi Judaism, which is those Jews that typically wear the black long trench coats and the hats and grow thick beards and sometimes even prefer not to speak Hebrew, use it strictly as a liturgical language. And they're very isolationists, as compared to modern Orthodox, or what we call in Israel national Judaism, or National Orthodox Judaism, which is a more modernized project of orthodoxy, which we can see the most clearly within the project of the settlements. People such as Naftali Bennett, which is the leader of the Jewish Home Party, which is exactly a modern Orthodox party, who, again, he looks more or less modernized, except he has a small yarmulke on his head, and that's essentially it. But when you listen to what they're saying, there is a striving somewhere, which, again, Judaism with genes. So it's interesting to consider this equivalency, but again, they're not equivalents because things are not equal, and Judaism is not Islam. But we can learn maybe something from equating, and this is a big idea that I think about a lot. In Israel, there's something that we say often. I don't say it, but a lot of people say. You can't equate. You're not allowed to equate. Usually it's said with reference to the Holocaust. And one person is saying, well, think about how the Nazis did, and then you tell them you can't equate. I think you're obligated to equate. But you need to equate from an understanding that things are never, ever equal. Only in math. So, I'll leave you with that. And for the time being, have an awesome weekend. And I'll see you guys soon.